Okay, friends, here we are. I think we should push on and get through essay 162. Now, of course, I don't read these essays beforehand. This is American Miscellany, and these essays are extraordinary miscellaneous in topic and in length. But, sometimes I kind of page through to get an idea of the length, and this is going to be, it's going to be a banger. This is going to be good. It's called Our Pilgrim Fathers. It's long. It's probably going to be quite boring and full of this moral superiority and all that. Hopefully, it's not offensive. It might be. I'm going to apologize beforehand. This book was published in 1865, and it does get offensive sometimes when they talk about the days of yore. The publisher, Robert Sears, did mention that the contents of this book are both historical and scientific. So hopefully they'll keep it above board. Our last essay was called Cincinnati. That was essay number 161. It's all about Cincinnati. Rather dry, but maybe Our Pilgrim Fathers will be slightly more interesting. So here we are on page 419 of American Miscellany. Let's get into essay number 162, Our Pilgrim Fathers. The settlement of New England forms an epoch in the history of colonization. Never until that time had such high principles and such noble minds been engaged in the great work of extending the bounds of the civilized world. Most of the founders of the new states have been driven abroad by necessity, while in others the spirit of adventure was kindled, sometimes by restless ambition or political discontent, sometimes by enlightened views of commercial profit, but oftener by dreams of sudden wealth. There we go, foundation of the nation. Okay, but in the fathers of New England, we behold a body of men who, for the liberty of faith alone, resolutely and deliberately exchanged the delights of home and the comforts of a civilized life for toil and danger, for an ungenial climate and a rugged soil. They were neither desperate adventurers nor ignorant fanatics. On the contrary, there is every evidence that they generally possessed a much higher degree of mental cultivation than was common at that period among the English people. Clearly. Indeed, the austerity of the moral habits of their immediate descendants, and the remarkable freedom of their language from the provincial dialects of England, afford ample evidence of the general character of their ancestors. They were men who spake the tongue that Shakespeare spake, the faith and morals held that Milton held. Nay, even if, in the pride of a vain philosophy, we should choose to suspect the praises of this portion of our English ancestry as being but the delusions of national vanity, and to dwell more upon their faults and follies than on their virtues, still it is impossible to refuse some share of admiration to the talents and courage of these voluntary exiles, if we regard them merely as a bold and honest portion of that party in church and state which, to borrow the coarse but strong language of Warburton, had outfought the Cavaliers, outprayed the Puritans, and outwitted the Parliament. The period at which they lived is very remarkable for having been fertile in every form of irregular greatness, and they partook largely of the character of their times. What's irregular greatness? I want to experience that, irregular greatness. In every great exertion of genius in that age, whether in poetry, in eloquence, in moral and theological speculation, or in active life, there was an incongruous and unaccountable mixture of the gigantic and childish, of glorious truth and miserable prejudice. Pope's criticism on the poetry of Milton may serve for a universal description of the talents of that day. Milton's strong opinion, now not heaven can bound, now serpent-like in puns, he sweeps the ground. To trace the rise and progress of communities, to follow the fortunes and elucidate the characters of those who have laid broad and deep the foundations of new associations, may seem perhaps to belong to the province of history rather than to that of a brief article on the present character. We will, however, attempt the task, and casting our eyes back for 2 centuries, contemplate the ancestry from which we have sprung, and the events and causes which were connected with their enterprise and achievements. It is a difficult thing to give a correct narrative of events which happened long ago, and concerning which there is either a deficiency or a great variety of contradictory testimony. But for us the task is not so laborious or uncertain in its results. The story of our origin as a people is not obscure. We are not compelled to trace back our race through the confusion of barbarism, or to free it from the obscurity of a fabulous narrative. The institutions of New England need no painful research or learned commentary. They have written and published themselves to the whole world, both by the lives and acts of those who established them, and by the fruits which they have not ceased to bear since the time of their formation. It is related in the old mythology that the Grecian goddess of wisdom sprung from the head of Jupiter, completely armed and every way mature. Quite as complete did New England spring into existence. From the first, she was endowed with all the attributes of society, with free institutions, with civil order, with a just regard for prosperity and protection for the rights of persons. The day on which New England dates her origin ought never to be forgotten nor disregarded. If the 4th of July, 1776 is in the estimation of the venerated John Adams, be a day to be forever commemorated, with meetings of the people, with bonfires, and all the signs of general rejoicing. So ought the 22nd of December, 1620, to be held in perpetual remembrance. Interesting. 9/11. By our observance of those days, let us say to those who have gone before us, if perchance such communication can be held with the departed, that we have not forgotten their labors, their sufferings, their dangers, or their sorrows. Yes, their children are grateful for the sacrificing they made and the trials they endured, proud of their descent from such illustrious progenitors, and jealous of the goodly inheritance they have received. Let us keep alive in our hearts the recollection of our homes, recall the great features of past centuries, and take care that our fathers' names be not forgotten among us. The children of New England, as such, do not arrogate to themselves any superiority over the inhabitants of any other part of the country, either as to origin or social progress thus far accomplished, conceding to all parts of the Union an origin as reputable and a progress as honorable as their own. They still may claim the right, as an individual family of the great community, to speak and write concerning those firm and patient spirits who laid the foundations of law and order, of constitutional freedom and rational progress, so broad and so firm that they can sustain unmoved the weight of any superstructure which may be elevated upon them. I don't know. I think perhaps the weight is too much now. If we look at the origin and first settlement of New England, in what annals do we find the history of a people to be compared to this? Uninfluenced by motives of ambition, unswayed by love of conquest, they abandoned all the attractions that home and safety could offer for the sole purpose of enjoying liberty of conscience, of thinking and acting according to their own convictions, unrestrained by the control of the old ecclesiastical and political institutions. Behold them setting forth on their new and dangerous enterprise, whose cheek blanches, what eye grows dim at the perils in their way, and what dire necessity drives them forth. It is not like the poverty which urges the starving Irishman to quit his native land. Sorry, the racism begins. I'm sorry. It is not like the poverty which urges the starving Irishman to quit his native land. Not like the Pole are they fugitive from the stern requirements of a military tyranny, nor, like the blue-eyed German of our day, do they go to escape the burdens of unrequited labor. Theirs is an impulse more powerful and more sacred. It is the still small voice of conscience, bidding them go forth into the wilderness to worship the God of their fathers in freedom and in peace, according to their own convictions and in their own way. So how come when I want to do that, that's the worst thing? And who compose this devoted band? That's why. It's because I'm one and they are multiple. And who compose this devoted band? Are they fierce and ignorant fanatics, or educated and well-informed men of large experience, sagacious and wise? The early settlers of Plymouth and New Haven numbered men distinguished for learning and personal standing. We might illustrate the assertion by referring to the characters of Winthrop, Carver, Bradford, Cotton, Brewster, Thatcher, Winslow, Hopkins, and others, whose names are recorded on the Pilgrim record. If we look at the whole body of the emigrants to New England, we can nowhere find names more eminent for prudence, steadfastness, honesty, and courage. If Lord Chatham could say that he had never read of a body of men superior to the Congress assembled at Philadelphia, what ought we to say of a body of men who did not venture on board ship till they had framed a general law for the government of their future community? In what records of history do we find evidence of such solemnity of purpose, such courage, and such perseverance? No quality of our fathers is more striking or more admirable than their love for order, their regard to the just restraints by which society is held together, property protected, and the rights of all established and secured. No men ever understood better than they the real nature of republican government, or more truly put it in practice than they in their sphere and circumstance. It should not be forgotten that when the project of settlement of New England was first entertained, the public sentiment in England had begun to be favorable to such an enterprise. The papal power and influence had been shaken from its supremacy, and the minds of men were roused to independent action. In the place of forms and masses, the unadulterated spirit of Christianity had begun to prevail, and if the enjoyment of genuine religious freedom were not yet received even in England, still the waves of public sentiment had begun to heave and show that the time was approaching when they could no longer be restrained. When a true religious sentiment comes to control the action of a man or a community, it takes complete and absolute possession. Then all other motives are worthless and all other subjects foreign. The strength of kings, the power of empires are nothing in comparison. All earthly things in opposition to it have lost their influence, for then the soul self-poised, cuts aloof from all worldly considerations, acts with regard only to what is divine and eternal, and holds itself responsible only to its God. This sentiment forms the basis of the characteristic institutions of New England. But it was not solely that they might enjoy this sentiment unmolested by ecclesiastical control that the first settlers of Plymouth sought this side of the Atlantic. That was not their only motive for leaving Holland. Not long after the Reformation, the Dutch established freedom for all forms of religion, so that as far as liberty of conscience was concerned, they had no cause of complaint. The Church of Robinson might have remained in Holland without suffering any restrictions. What then were the motives which first moved the Pilgrims to leave Holland with the design of establishing new institutions far away from the land of their birth, among savage tribes and on rock-bound and inhospitable shores? The religious motive was the controlling one, no doubt. They left England for this cause, but joined with that there were other causes for this new migration. First, there was a feeling of human misery. They were strangers in a strange land, yearning for kindred associations, and with a love for their own native land in their bosoms, which no absence could subdue, and no circumstances cause them to forget. According to Governor Bradford, there was also the motive of poverty. They desired a better and easier place of living. In Holland, they saw that in a few years they must be extinguished. Oh my God, I'm looking that right in the face. Like, that is my moment in life right now. I am staring that in the barrel, that in a few years I'm going to be extinguished simply from poverty. That's insane. But they had somewhere to go. Guess there's always a realm to go to. Moreover, as necessity was a task matter over them, so they were forced to be such to their children and their servants. And what was worse, many of their children were drawn away by the evil example of the Dutch, some becoming soldiers, and there was thus danger that after the death of the fathers, their names as Englishmen and their faith would become extinct. And last, but by no means least, they had the hope of advancing the kingdom of Christ in these remote parts of the world. They knew that there were difficulties which must be met with courage, fortitude, and patience, but they knew too that the ends they had in view were good, their calling lawful and urgent, and that though they should lose their lives, yet their endeavors would be honorable. Honorable indeed were the endeavors sustained by such high principles and carried out with such indomitable energy and steadiness. Another cause was the desire of educating their children as they had been educated themselves, which in Leyden was impossible. Yes, the love of the familiar institutions and customs of one's native land, the yearning for kindred associations, that homesickness of the heart, which even the great Roman orator could not suppress, are all observable in our ancestors. To satisfy these impulses, they sought America. On these distant shores, they would still be the subjects of the same king. They would be Englishmen still, their country still the same, exiles no more, but a part of the British Empire. The same flag that waved over the fields of their fathers, fame would float over them, assuring them of its protection. They were proud of the nation from which they had sprung. They would not suffer the ties that bound them to the spot where they were born to be entirely severed. Englishmen they would live and die, though in a distant land, preserving both their nationality and the language of their youth. And which of us is not ready to thank them for this great gift of this noble language, which our mothers first taught us to speak? How grateful we may be that it was not lost in the jargon of Holland. Who that peruses this would not rather have first spoken its accents than, as Dr. Johnson expresses it, to have been trained to babble French? Who would change it for the soft voice of Italy or the sonorous dialect of Spain? It is the language of Shakespeare and Milton. It is the language of the Pilgrims. And having sounded alarms in the cause of freedom through the tongues of Burke and Chatham, it has come to discharge the same office in the voices of Clay and Webster. It is the language of free-born men, destined to spread it out over hilltop and valley. Nor will it cease to vibrate till liberty shall cease to have an abode upon this earth. We might here disprove the charges sometimes brought against the Pilgrims that they took the land already partially occupied by the Indians. As a question of morals, we are not altogether clear that savages have a right to shut out culture and improvement, a large portion of territory. The axe of the woodman rings quite as pleasantly in his ears as the war whoop of the savage. Besides, it is well known and admitted that the Pilgrims were always regardful of the rights of the natives. The world may be challenged to show one instance in which the first settlers disregarded the rights of the Indians. In their personal and political relations, they were always on good terms with them, and it was not till more than half a century after the arrival of the Mayflower that peace with the savages was disturbed. After the first struggles of the Pilgrims for existence were over, we soon view them marching forward in the establishment of the new state. Having the power of making laws, they entered on the business with clear conceptions of what they had to perform. They formed statistics suited to their own conditions, not based on any traditions. They evidently had a due respect for the English, but yet their reflections on the subject were entirely original. With bold defiance of custom, they commenced the course of legal reform from the first. They exhibited no blind disregard of what was already in existence, while they instituted the most rigid inquiry as to how much of antiquity was suited to present exigencies. They were the pioneers of law reform, and in fact, nearly all of the important alterations made in the laws of our free states within 50 years were directly borrowed from New England, and especially from Connecticut. There was not a suggestion in the statement of Lord Brougham of the reforms needed in the English law which was not anticipated in the legislation of the Eastern states. Imprisonment for debt was abolished there 200 years ago. The Act of the State of New York abolishing imprisonment for debt was almost exactly a transcript of the law of 1620 in Connecticut. The chief difference between the two statutes was that this primitive one was clear and explicit, while the modern was so confused and uncertain that totally different constructions were put upon it by different persons. Yeah, here we go. It's not new, friends. It's not new. If we contrast the laws of New England with those of Great Britain, they will show the vast improvements made by the Pilgrims in the registration of land, the laws of marriage, dower, divorce, inheritance, and in criminal law, to the clear understanding of civil and political rights which prevailed in New England from the beginning, may be attributed the ease with which the colonies in that quarter passed into the new form of government after the Revolution. False notions have been very generally entertained with regard to the early legislation of the colony of New Haven. The Blue Laws of Connecticut, as they are called, have become bywords of ridicule and reproach. And yet there is nothing more solemn, nothing more grave and dignified, nothing more imposing to be found in the records of history than the first acts of that colony. To the illustration of this point, had we the requisite room, much argument might be devoted. That colony adopted the Old Testament polity, that colony adopted the Old Testament polity, and their chief requirements in their rulers were that they should be men fearing God, lovers of truth, hating covetousness. And if we could have such men for our candidates now, 161 years ago, every good man in the Union would identify himself with that party. The charge of religious intolerance is often made. The Pilgrims did not come to New England for the purpose of establishing universal toleration. They came to preserve their own faith. And what if they were misguided and overzealous? We are not to judge them.